Mr. Grimm's Tower. What do you see on this cover? A man, two birds. How does this man look like? He looks a bit hairy. Does he look happy? No, he looks a bit grumpy to me. Mr. Grimm lived in the middle of town. He liked his house, but he didn't like the hustle and bustle of town. There were too many people. There was too much noise. Wow, there were a lot of people here in the town. Where is Mr. Grimm's house? Here. Here is his house. All day, Mr. Grimm could hear horses and carts clatter by his front door. He could not work. It made him very grumpy. "Keep quiet!" Mr. Grimm shouted. He is Mr. Grimm. How does he look? He looks very hairy and he looks very grumpy. He was shouting, "Keep quiet!" Have you seen this lady? She is Winnie the Witch. All night, Mr. Grimm could hear people singing in the streets. Merrily we stroll along. He could hear them snoring in their beds. He could not sleep. It made him very grouchy. "Keep quiet!" Mr. Grimm shouted. He is Mr. Grimm shouting. Whenever people saw him, they said, "Look out! Here comes Mr. Grimm. He is a very grumpy and grouchy man." So one day, Mr. Grimm made up his mind. He packed his bags and went to live in the tall tower at the top of the cliffs. Mr. Grimm packed his suitcase and went to live in the tall tower at the top of the cliffs. The tower was old and dark, but Mr. Grimm loved it. He loved the peace and quiet. He loved the way the stairs turned and twisted to the very top. Most of all, Mr. Grimm loved the views from the big round windows. Here's Mr. Grimm walking on the stairs, and the stairs were twisting and turning to the top. Here's the big round window. From his tower, Mr. Grimm could look out over the hustle and bustle of town. What a nice view! From his tower, he could see the hills and trees of the countryside. Best of all, Mr. Grimm could look far out to sea. He loved sitting in the window. He loved watching the boats sail past. There were tall boats and long boats, paddle boats and rowing boats. So many boats and ships here. But Mr. Grimm was still not truly happy. During the day, nobody came to visit. The tower looked dark and creepy. Mr. Grimm still looked grumpy and grouchy. When Mr. Grimm waved, people ran away. Here's Mr. Grimm's tower. It does look very dark and creepy. Mr. Grimm was waving, but the people were running away. Why were they running away? I think they were a bit scared of Mr. Grimm. Only the seagulls came to visit and they just made a mess. Mr. Grimm had to spend most of his time cleaning the tower. "Go away!" he shouted, waving his fist at the birds. Here are the seagulls. What are these white dots? Those were birds' poo-poo. No wonder Mr. Grimm was so upset. He was shouting, "Go away!" And he was waving his fist. He was waving his fist at the bird. At night, the tower looked very dark and creepy. Mr. Grimm could not sleep. Ships and boats could not see the cliffs. They crashed into them. The thumping and bumping kept Mr. Grimm awake. Bum! The ship was bumping into the cliffs. "Oh, sorry!" Wow, look at that. The tower was shaking. If he did get to sleep, he was woken by sailors knocking on his door. They asked for hot drinks and blankets. "Go away!" shouted Mr. Grimm. He covered his head with a pillow. Here are the sailors. They were knocking on the door. Knock, knock. And Mr. Grimm was shouting, "Go away!" Soon the sailors stopped knocking. Now no one came to his tower at all, except for the messy seagulls. This made Mr. Grimm feel very grumpy indeed. Here are the seagulls, and they were pooping. One day, Mr. Grimm looked in the mirror. He frowned at what he saw. "What a grumpy, grouchy, hairy old man you are," he said. "It's time for a change." Mr. Grimm was looking into a mirror, and he saw himself very hairy and very grumpy. So, the very next day, Mr. Grimm made up his mind. He went into town for his once-a-year shave and haircut. "That's much better," said Mr. Grimm, and he grinned a little grin. Mr. Grimm got his hair cut, and he looked much tidier. Outside the barber shop, something gave him an idea. He dashed into Best Buy's. He got some paint. When he got back to his tower, Mr. Grimm started working. You see this red and white pole? It is called barber's pole. When you see this pole, that means this shop is a barber shop. Mr. Grimm found a paintbrush. He painted his tower white from top to bottom. "There," said Mr. Grimm. "Now those seagulls can make as much mess as they like. No one will ever know." Mr. Grimm painted the tower white from top to bottom. Why do you think he painted it white? Then Mr. Grimm painted bright red rings around the tower. He wanted to make it look cheerful and friendly. Mr. Grimm really got his idea from the barber's pole. Next, he put a huge light at the top of the tower. Now everyone would be able to see it, even in the dark. No one will bump into the cliffs now, said Mr. Grimm happily, and I can get some sleep. Mr. Grimm put a big light at the top of the tower, and he was thinking, tonight I could get some sleep. Mr. Grimm is so clever. He finds a solution for his problems, a solution good for himself, good for the sailors, and good for the seagulls too. Mr. Grimm's home no longer looked like a tall, dark tower. It looked like a tall lighthouse. During the day, people came to see Mr. Grimm's tall lighthouse. When they saw it, they smiled. Mr. Grimm smiled back. There were so many people visiting Mr. Grimm's tower now. At night, the sailors smiled. They saw the light at the top of Mr. Grimm's house. It warned them that the cliffs were ahead. Mr. Grimm was happy in his tall lighthouse. He stopped feeling grumpy and grouchy. People even started to call him Mr. Green. This made Mr. Grimm even happier. He even gave the people tours around his lighthouse, and he could earn some money. He is so smart. Mr. Grimm's lighthouse was very popular. Lots more lighthouses were built on the top of cliffs all over the world. Perhaps you have seen one? Here is Mr. Grimm's lighthouse. And there are more lighthouses now. Here is a lighthouse. Lighthouses. A lighthouse is like a giant flashlight. The light flashes all night. It helps boats find their way and stops them crashing into rocks. Today, most boats use computers to find their way. They don't need lighthouses. Many lighthouses are now museums and tourist attractions. Some lighthouses have even been made into homes. Would you live in a lighthouse? And that's the end. Mr. Grimm's Tower. Mr. Grimm is a grumpy, grouchy man. What will make him happy?